When I heard through the grapevine that Mason had gotten married and bought a house in his new city, I finally understood that he wasn't coming back, wasn't going to suddenly realize he'd made a mistake pursuing. You know what's funny? Everyone keeps asking me if I regret it. Like, seriously? 8 years with the same routine, the same boring conversations, the same predictable everything, and I'm supposed to regret finally feeling alive again? Mason thinks he caught me doing something terrible, but honestly, maybe I just finally figured out what I actually wanted. I'm Hazel, I'm 32, and I need to get this off my chest because, honestly, I don't have anyone else who would understand. My friends are all married with kids or living states away, and my parents would just lecture me about commitment and blah blah blah. So here I am, talking to you because you won't judge me for telling the truth about what really happened. Mason and I met at work. I handled client billing, he was in the maintenance department. Different floors, different worlds really, but we kept running into each other at lunch. He was sweet, always asking about my day, remembering little things I mentioned, bringing me coffee when he knew I was stressed. Looking back, I should have seen it as clingy, but at 24, I thought it was romantic. We started hanging out after work, watching movies at his tiny apartment, talking about nothing important until way too late. It felt safe, comfortable, like slipping into warm pajamas after a long day. After about a year, I moved in with him because it made financial sense and, honestly, he made it so easy. He never pressured me, just casually mentioned how much we could save on rent, how we were practically living together anyway. 2 years later, we bought our little house with the white fence and the mortgage that felt like grown-up chains around my ankles. Everyone said we were so responsible, so mature, such a perfect couple. Mason loved that kind of praise. He'd beam whenever someone complimented our relationship like he'd won some contest I didn't remember entering. Our life was predictable. Mason would wake up at 6:30 every morning, kiss my forehead while I pretended to sleep, make coffee for both of us in those matching mugs his mom gave us for Christmas. He'd ask how I slept, tell me about his weird dreams, remind me about dinner plans or weekend projects we'd discussed. Weekends were grocery shopping, cleaning the house, maybe a movie if we felt adventurous. He was always suggesting little improvements to the house, little trips we could take, little traditions we could start. It was like he was constantly trying to make our life more perfect, when I was starting to feel suffocated by how perfect it already was. We talked about kids sometimes, but I always said, not yet, maybe later, because the idea of being even more tied down made my chest tight. Mason would nod understandingly, say there was no rush, that he was happy with just us for now. His contentment with our boring little life started to irritate me in ways I couldn't explain to him without sounding like a complete bitch. Here was this man who loved me exactly as I was, who was thrilled to spend Saturday mornings drinking coffee and reading different sections of the newspaper, and I felt like I was slowly dying inside. I started picking fights over stupid things just to feel something other than comfortable numbness. When he left dishes in the sink, when he forgot to buy the right brand of pasta, when he wanted to watch another one of his documentaries instead of going out somewhere with actual people. He'd apologize, fix whatever I was complaining about, try to make me happy, which somehow made it worse. I wanted him to fight back, to show some passion, to prove he cared about something enough to argue for it. Instead, he'd just look confused and hurt, asking what he could do to make things better. The worst part was how everyone loved Mason. My friends thought he was amazing, my parents adored him, even strangers could see how devoted he was to me. He'd light up when I walked into a room, remember conversations I'd forgotten we had, surprise me with little gifts or gestures that showed he was always thinking about me. But instead of feeling grateful, I felt trapped by his attention. Every sweet thing he did felt like another expectation, another way he was trying to lock me into this small, safe life we'd built together. I kept thinking there had to be more than this, more than shared grocery lists and discussions about refinancing our mortgage and his gentle snoring next to me every night. I wanted to feel desired, not just loved. I wanted uncertainty, excitement, someone who would challenge me instead of just accommodating my every mood. Mason's predictable devotion started feeling less like love and more like habit, and I began to resent him for being exactly the steady, reliable man I thought I wanted when I was 24 and stupid. Then Dante happened, and suddenly I remembered what it felt like to be fully awake. He reached out through a professional networking platform about some consulting work, but our messages quickly became personal. Where Mason asked about my day like he was checking items off a list, Dante asked about my ambitions, my frustrations, what I really wanted from life. Where Mason was content with our routine, Dante challenged my opinions and made me defend my thoughts. He was sophisticated, well-traveled, the kind of man who had opinions about wine and politics and art. Talking to him felt like exercising muscles I'd forgotten I had. Those text conversations became the highlight of my days. I'd find myself smiling at my phone in ways that made Mason ask who I was texting, and I'd lie easily saying it was work stuff or one of my girlfriends. The lying came so naturally it scared me a little, but not enough to stop. Dante made me feel intelligent, interesting, desired in ways that had nothing to do with matching coffee mugs and mortgage payments. When he suggested meeting for that weekend training session in his city, we both knew exactly what he was really asking. And God help me, I wanted it more than I'd wanted anything in years. I told Mason about the training like it was any other work obligation, watching him nod supportively and offer to handle the bills while I was gone. He even helped me pick out professional outfits, asking if I needed anything else for the trip, telling me how proud he was that I was investing in my career. Standing there, watching him iron my shirts while I planned my affair, I felt like I was split in two. Part of me disgusted by my deception, part of me thrilled by the secret life I was creating. But I pushed down the guilt because I told myself I deserved to remember what passion felt like, even if it meant breaking the heart of the man who'd spent 8 years trying to make me happy. That weekend with Dante was everything I'd been craving and didn't even know I needed. The hotel was nicer than anywhere Mason and I had ever stayed, with actual room service and Egyptian cotton sheets that felt like silk against my skin. Dante was confident in ways that made Mason seem boyish and uncertain. He ordered wine without looking at prices, had opinions about the restaurant's atmosphere, commanded attention from waitstaff in ways that made me feel important just by association. When he touched me, it wasn't with Mason's gentle, familiar caresses, but with real hunger, like he couldn't get enough of me. But it was more than just the physical connection, though God knows that part was incredible after years of routine intimacy with Mason. Dante and I talked about philosophy, about ambition, about all the places we wanted to travel and experiences we wanted to have. He made me realize how small my world had become, how I'd let myself shrink to fit into Mason's comfortable but limited vision of what life should be. We stayed up until 3 a.m. discussing books I'd read but never talked about with Mason, sharing dreams I'd forgotten I had. There were moments that weekend when Dante's attention would shift to his phone, when he'd mention other clients or obligations in ways that reminded me he had a whole life I wasn't part of. When I tried to steer conversations toward our future or what this meant, he'd deflect with kisses or suggestions for room service. But I was so high on feeling desired and interesting again that I ignored those warning signs. I convinced myself his evasiveness was just discretion. That, of course, we couldn't make concrete plans when I was still technically with Mason. Sunday morning, lying in those perfect sheets while Dante showered, I felt more like myself than I had in years. I looked in the bathroom mirror and saw someone vibrant and alive, someone worth pursuing and fighting for. The woman staring back at me wasn't the tired, comfortable partner who split grocery bills and discussed refinancing options. She was exciting, mysterious, worthy of grand gestures and passionate declarations. The drive home felt like returning to a black and white movie after experiencing Technicolor. Mason greeted me at the door with genuine excitement, asking about every detail of my training, making dinner while I unpacked and tried to wash Dante's cologne out of my hair. He'd bought my favorite ice cream while I was gone, cleaned the house until it sparkled, and had clearly spent the weekend missing me in ways that suddenly felt suffocating rather than sweet. When he kissed me hello, all I could think about was how different it felt from Dante's mouth, how predictable and safe and boring everything about our life together had become. Over the next few weeks, I found myself living for Dante's messages and calls while going through the motions of my relationship with Mason. I'd watch Mason make his morning coffee and think about how Dante drank espresso and had opinions about Ethiopian beans. When Mason wanted to discuss weekend plans, I'd remember how spontaneous Dante was, how he'd suggested midnight drives and talked about taking me to jazz clubs in the city. Everything Mason did, his earnest questions about my day, his gentle back rubs, his contentment with our routine, felt like settling for less than what I now knew was possible. The worst part was how oblivious Mason remained to my growing detachment. He'd still kiss my forehead in the mornings, still bring me coffee made exactly how I liked it, still light up when I came home from work. His consistent devotion started feeling less like love and more like emotional laziness, like he'd stopped trying to really know me because he assumed he already did. When Dante challenged my opinions or pushed back on my ideas, it felt like he saw me as complex and interesting. When Mason agreed with everything I said, it felt like he saw me as fragile and simple. I started creating excuses to be away. Work happy hours I'd never attended before, shopping trips that lasted hours longer than necessary, visits to friends who lived conveniently close to Dante's usual hotel. Each lie came easier than the last, and I told myself they were necessary little deceptions that protected Mason from truths that would only hurt him unnecessarily. I was becoming someone I didn't recognize, but instead of feeling guilty about it, I felt liberated. Finally, I was choosing what I wanted instead of what was expected of me. Mason began asking more questions, gentle, concerned inquiries about why I seemed distant, whether something was bothering me, if there was anything he could do to help. His willingness to take responsibility for my mood changes annoyed me more than comforted me. I wanted him to get suspicious, to demand answers, to show some fire instead of just absorbing my coldness and trying to fix whatever he assumed he'd done wrong. His patience with my obvious emotional absence felt like another sign that he didn't really know me at all. The discovery happened on a random Thursday evening when I got careless. I'd left my phone on the kitchen counter while taking a shower, and it buzzed with a message from Dante. Something flirtatious and inside jokey that would have been innocent to most people, but carried weight between us. Mason saw the name, and I could tell by his expression when I came downstairs that something had shifted. He didn't say anything immediately, just got quiet in a way that was different from his usual thoughtful silence. Later that night, I caught him looking at me strangely, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he'd never noticed before. When I asked what was wrong, he just shook his head and said he was tired. But I knew Mason well enough after 8 years to recognize when he was processing something he didn't want to confront. Part of me wanted him to ask direct questions, to force the conversation I'd been avoiding. Another part of me was relieved that his conflict-avoidant nature meant I didn't have to deal with accusations or demands for explanations. A week later, Dante suggested another weekend meeting, this time in his home city, for what he called a follow-up consultation. I knew it was bullshit, knew we were past pretending this was professional, but I wanted to see him so desperately that I crafted an elaborate story about expanded training opportunities. Mason listened to my explanation with a strange expression, asking more specific questions about the program than he usually did. When I got defensive about his sudden interest in my career development, he apologized and said he was just proud of me for being so dedicated. Looking back, I think he suspected something, but couldn't bring himself to believe I'd actually cheat on him. Mason had always seen the best in people, especially in me. He'd probably convinced himself that his suspicions were unfounded jealousy, that 8 years of relationship stability meant something, that I wouldn't throw away everything we'd built for some guy he'd never heard of. His trust in me felt both touching and infuriating. Touching because it showed how much he believed in our relationship. Infuriating because it made him seem naive and easy to deceive. That Saturday morning, I kissed Mason goodbye and told him I'd call when I got to the hotel. He hugged me longer than usual, told me he loved me in a voice that sounded almost pleading, and watched from the window as I drove away. In my rearview mirror, I could see him standing there long after I'd turned the corner. And something about his stillness made my stomach twist with guilt. I immediately pushed away. I told myself he'd be fine, that he'd probably spend the weekend working on one of his little home improvement projects and wouldn't even miss me. The weekend with Dante was different this time. He seemed distracted, checking his phone constantly and taking calls he said were work emergencies. When I asked about his weekend plans or suggested things we could do together, he'd get vague about timing and logistics. The sex was still incredible, but afterwards he'd roll away to check messages instead of holding me like he had before. I started feeling clingy and desperate, in ways that reminded me of how Mason sometimes seemed with me, trying too hard to capture someone's full attention. Sunday afternoon, Dante told me he had to cut our time short for a client dinner he'd forgotten about. I offered to come with him, but he laughed and said it would be inappropriate given the circumstances. Standing in that hotel room, watching him pack his expensive clothes while I sat on the bed in a bathrobe, I felt foolish and used in ways I hadn't expected. When I tried to pin down our next meeting, he became evasive, saying his schedule was crazy and he'd have to check his calendar. The drive home felt different than the previous time. Instead of returning triumphant and alive, I felt hollow and uncertain. Dante's behavior had shifted from pursuing me to tolerating my pursuit of him, and I couldn't figure out what I'd done wrong or how to get to the intensity we'd shared initially. When I pulled into our driveway, Mason's car wasn't there, which was strange because he'd said he'd be working around the house all weekend. I called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I texted asking where he was, but got no response. By Sunday night, I was genuinely worried something had happened to him. I called his brother, who seemed surprised to hear from me, and said Mason was fine but couldn't come to the phone. When I pressed for details, he just said Mason needed some space and would contact me when he was ready. The dismissive tone in his voice made it clear he knew exactly what I'd done and thought I was getting what I deserved. Monday morning, I found a note on the kitchen counter, written in Mason's careful handwriting. It simply said, "I saw you. Don't call. Don't text. I need time." My first thought wasn't guilt or regret, it was panic about how he'd found out. Had he followed me? Hired someone to investigate? Gone through my phone when I wasn't looking? The idea that quiet, trusting Mason had been secretly suspicious enough to catch me felt like a violation, even though I was the one who'd been lying for months. I called him anyway, multiple times, letting the phone ring until voicemail picked up. I sent long texts explaining that we needed to talk, that things weren't what they seemed, that I could explain everything if he'd just come home. But my phone stayed silent. The house felt enormous and empty without his presence. No morning coffee brewing, no gentle questions about my plans, no background noise of his projects or television shows. I'd wanted space from his constant attention. And now I had more space than I knew what to do with. Work became impossible to focus on because I kept checking my phone for responses that never came. My colleagues asked if I was okay, if something was wrong, but I couldn't exactly explain that my husband had discovered my affair and vanished without a trace. I made excuses about family stress and deadlines, but I could tell people were starting to notice my distraction and mood swings. Dante became even more elusive during this time, responding to my messages with short, non-committal replies when he bothered responding at all. When I tried calling, he'd let it go to voicemail and text back hours later saying he was in meetings or dealing with client emergencies. The passion and intensity I'd been craving from him seemed to evaporate the moment my marriage imploded, leaving me feeling abandoned by both men in my life simultaneously. 2 weeks after Mason left, I drove to his brother's house and sat in my car across the street, hoping to catch sight of him. I felt pathetic and desperate, but I needed to see him, needed to gauge whether he looked as destroyed as I felt, or if he was moving on with the same quiet determination he approached everything else. When his brother came out to get the mail and spotted me, he walked over to my car with an expression that made me roll down my window reluctantly. He told me that Mason didn't want to see me, didn't want me contacting him, and that I needed to respect his decision and leave him alone. When I tried to explain that there had been a misunderstanding, that I needed to make things right, he just shook his head and said some things couldn't be fixed with explanations. The way he looked at me, with disappointment and disgust I'd never seen from someone who'd known me for 8 years, made me realize that Mason had told him everything, and that whatever sympathy his family had once had for me was completely gone. The weeks turned into a month, then 2 months, and still no word from Mason. I started driving by places we used to go together, hoping to run into him accidentally, but he seemed to have completely disappeared from our shared world. Our mutual friends were awkward when I reached out, giving short responses about being busy or unavailable when I suggested getting together. It became clear that Mason had told people what happened, and they'd chosen sides without giving me a chance to defend myself. Meanwhile, Dante's texts became increasingly infrequent until they stopped altogether. When I finally got desperate enough to call his office, his assistant told me he was traveling indefinitely and couldn't be reached. I found myself obsessively checking his social media profiles, looking for clues about where he was or who he was with, feeling like a stalker, but unable to stop myself from searching for answers about why he'd suddenly lost interest in me. The house we'd shared became a constant reminder of the life I'd thrown away. Every room held memories of Mason. The kitchen where he'd made our morning coffee, the living room where we'd watched movies, the bedroom where I'd lied to his face about weekend training sessions. I couldn't afford the mortgage payments alone, but I also couldn't bring myself to put the house on the market, because doing so would mean accepting that our relationship was really over. 3 months after Mason left, I finally heard from Dante again. Not the romantic reunion I'd been hoping for, but a brief text saying he'd started seeing someone seriously and thought it was best if we stopped communicating altogether. The casual cruelty of being dismissed via text message after everything I'd sacrificed for him hit me harder than I expected. I realized that while I'd been obsessing over our connection and planning our future together, he'd been treating our affair as a temporary distraction that had run its course. I tried calling him one last time, desperate to understand what had changed, why I wasn't worth fighting for when I'd given up an 8-year relationship for him. When he finally answered, his voice was cold and annoyed in ways I'd never heard before. He told me he'd never promised me anything permanent, that he'd thought I understood what our arrangement was, and that my marriage problems weren't his responsibility to solve. The man who'd made me feel sophisticated and desirable now spoke to me like I was an embarrassing mistake he needed to clean up quickly. The worst part was realizing how delusional I'd been about what we'd meant to each other. All those meaningful conversations, those intense connections I'd thought we shared, the way he'd made me feel special and understood, it had all been part of a pattern for him. I was probably one of many married women he'd seduced with the same techniques, the same flattery, the same promises of excitement and sophistication. The weekend that had felt like the beginning of my real life had just been another conquest for him, nothing more. Meanwhile, I learned through our old coworkers that Mason had transferred to a different branch in another state. He'd requested the move just weeks after leaving our house, apparently telling his supervisor he needed a fresh start for personal reasons. The fact that he'd uprooted his entire life rather than try to work things out with me felt like the ultimate rejection. Mason, who'd spent 8 years trying to make me happy, had finally decided I wasn't worth the effort. I started dating again out of desperation more than genuine interest, but every interaction felt hollow compared to the intensity I'd shared with Dante or the comfortable security I'd had with Mason. The men I met online seemed to sense my neediness, my desperation to prove I was still desirable and worth pursuing. First dates turned into awkward encounters where I talked too much about my recent divorce, fishing for validation and reassurance I wasn't going to find from strangers. My friends had mostly moved on without me during the months I'd been obsessing over Mason and Dante. When I reached out, trying to rebuild those connections, conversations felt strained and artificial. They'd ask polite questions about how I was doing, but I could tell they weren't really interested in the messy details of my imploded marriage. The couples we'd socialized with had clearly chosen Mason's side, and the single friends I'd neglected during my affair had formed new routines that didn't include me. Financial reality hit hard when I finally admitted I couldn't manage the house payments alone. Putting it on the market meant dealing with Mason through lawyers and real estate agents, since he still refused to communicate with me directly. The process was humiliating, having to explain our situation to professionals who looked at me with barely concealed judgment, watching Mason sign papers from across conference rooms while avoiding eye contact, splitting up 8 years of shared belongings through legal intermediaries. The house sold quickly, but after paying off the mortgage and dividing assets, I barely had enough for a security deposit on a small apartment across town. Moving from our spacious home with its garden and 2-car garage to a cramped 1-bedroom felt like being demoted from adult to college student. Everything about my new living situation reminded me of how much I'd lost, how far I'd fallen from the comfortable middle-class life Mason and I had built together. 6 months after the separation, I ran into one of Mason's coworkers at a coffee shop near my new apartment. She seemed uncomfortable seeing me, but mentioned that Mason was doing well in his new position, that he seemed happier than he'd been in a long time. When I pressed for more details, she reluctantly told me he'd been promoted and was seeing someone new, a woman who worked in his department who everyone thought was perfect for him. The news hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been struggling to rebuild my life from the ashes of my own choices, Mason had apparently moved on with ease. The man who'd spent 8 years devoted to me had found someone else worthy of his attention in a matter of months, while I was still obsessing over both him and Dante like some pathetic teenager. I found myself driving past his old workplace, hoping to catch a glimpse of him or his new girlfriend, feeling like a stalker, but unable to stop myself from seeking information about his new life. The 1.5 years after everything imploded, I discovered through social media that Mason was engaged. The announcement showed up on my feed through a mutual friend's shared post, a picture of him and a woman I'd never seen before, both of them glowing with happiness that looked nothing like the comfortable contentment he'd shown with me. She was pretty in an understated way, the kind of woman who looked genuinely kind and stable, nothing like the dramatic complexity I'd always prided myself on having. What destroyed me wasn't just that he'd moved on, but how completely he seemed to have thrived without me. The Mason in that engagement photo looked confident and peaceful in ways I'd never seen during our 8 years together. His smile was broader, his posture more relaxed, his whole presence more alive than I remembered him being with me. It was like he'd been holding himself back during our entire relationship, and my betrayal had finally freed him to become the person he was supposed to be. I spent hours analyzing every detail of his social media posts, looking for signs that he was settling or compromising or making the same mistakes he'd made with me. But everything I saw suggested the opposite. They traveled together, had inside jokes I didn't understand, shared interests that had never existed between us. The life they were building looked effortless and genuine, nothing like the forced domesticity I'd felt trapped by when I was the one sharing his bed and his mortgage. Meanwhile, my own life had stagnated in ways that felt increasingly permanent. I'd been through a series of disappointing relationships with men who either treated me poorly or bored me senseless. None of them had Dante's sophistication or Mason's devotion, and I found myself constantly comparing them to memories that were probably more idealized than realistic. I was living paycheck to paycheck in an apartment I hated, working longer hours to cover expenses I used to split, surrounded by reminders of how much I'd lost. The worst part was the growing realization that I'd thrown away something genuinely valuable for something completely worthless. Mason's love had been real, steady, the kind of foundation people spend their whole lives searching for, and I'd treated it like a prison sentence. Dante's passion had been an illusion, a performance designed to get what he wanted from women who were stupid enough to believe they were special. I'd traded 8 years of authentic partnership for a few weekends of fantasy. And now I had neither. My friends had moved on with their own lives, the few who still kept in touch treating me with polite distance rather than real friendship. They'd invite me to group gatherings out of obligation, but I could tell they found my bitterness exhausting and my inability to move on pathetic. When they talked about their own relationships, their career successes, their future plans, I felt like I was watching life from behind glass, unable to participate in the forward momentum everyone else seemed to have naturally. 2 years after Mason left, I was still working the same job, still living in the same cramped apartment, still dating men who reminded me why being alone might actually be preferable. I'd gained weight from stress eating and lost the confidence that had once made me feel attractive and desirable. The woman who'd felt sophisticated and worldly during those weekends with Dante now felt tired and bitter. Someone who complained too much and smiled too little. When I heard through the grapevine that Mason had gotten married and bought a house in his new city, I finally understood that he wasn't coming back, wasn't going to suddenly realize he'd made a mistake and want to reconcile. The finality of his marriage to someone else forced me to accept what I'd been denying for 2 years, that I'd destroyed the best relationship I'd ever had for the worst decision I'd ever made, and that some mistakes don't get second chances.